Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a really fascinating journey back in time. We are going to unpack a modern pastor's sermon that's actually drawn directly from the ancient historical story of Naomi and Ruth. Our goal here is to see exactly how this incredibly rich ancient text is being used right now, today, to deliver some pretty heavy messages about motherhood, resilience, and family dynamics.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does a 3,000-year-old tragedy inform modern Mother's Day advice? I mean, you have to admit, it's a massive gap to bridge, right? You've got ancient historical texts on one side, and then the everyday modern family dynamics on the other. But the sermon we're analyzing today does exactly that. It draws a direct, unbroken line from the absolutely devastating losses of an ancient family straight to the everyday challenges of modern women.
So, we're breaking this whole thing down into three parts, starting with Act 1, the world of Ruth and relocation. To really grasp the message the pastor is delivering here, we first have to understand the extreme stakes of the original text. Think about this for a second. The story of Ruth is 3,000 years old. Their culture was absolutely nothing like ours. We're talking about a harsh, ancient agricultural world. No technology, no life insurance policies, literally zero modern financial safety nets. You survived based entirely on the physical land you owned and the family you had to work that land. That's it. And that setup creates a terrifying reality for the women of that era. In ancient Israel, land ownership was strictly patriarchal, and farming was heavy manual labor. So losing the men in your family, that essentially meant total destitution. A widow couldn't just, take over the family farm or run into town to get a corporate job. Without male relatives, she faced a severe, literally life-threatening risk of absolute poverty. Which brings us to a really crucial concept for this story, the kinsman redeemer. In ancient Israelite law, this was a specific male relative who was legally responsible for buying back lost family land or even marrying a widow to keep that family's lineage alive. You can think of it as an ancient cultural safety net, and this specific legal mechanism is the driving force for the entire narrative we're about to explore. So let's map out just how catastrophic things get for our main character, Naomi. It starts in year one, when a brutal famine in Bethlehem forces her entire family to pack up and relocate. By year two, they've settled in the foreign pagan land of Moab. They're making it work. But then, fast forward to year 10, and complete tragedy strikes. Naomi suffers the unimaginable loss of her husband and then both of her sons. So she's left entirely stranded in a foreign land with just her two widowed daughters-in-law. And it's right here in the story that the sermon makes its very first modern pastoral application. The speaker tells his audience, mothers can be used by God to help their families flourish anywhere. He actually uses Naomi's initial forced relocation to Moab to praise the immense adaptability of mothers. The point he's making is that women have this unique, almost innate ability to set up shop and turn a house into a true home, completely regardless of the location. And this brilliantly illustrates the speaker's specific complementarian views on gender roles. The sermon clearly categorizes these distinct, complementary purposes for men and women. Masculinity, in his view, is seen through the lens of being foundation layers and builders of cities, essentially motivated by occupational success, provision, and physical needs. Femininity, on the other hand, is defined by the ability to create homes, foster really deep relational connections, and be motivated by words of affirmation. To really hammer this point home, the speaker shares a super vivid personal anecdote. He talks about a time he visited a literal dump in Tijuana. He recounts walking into this tiny shack made entirely out of salvaged corrugated metal and an old door. But inside, he finds a young woman lovingly sweeping the dirt floor. He notes that despite the extreme grinding poverty, he felt incredible warmth and true hospitality in that space. So for the pastor, this is real-world proof that women possess a profound ability to make a home absolutely anywhere. Now we transition into Act 2, the furnace of relational difficulty. This part of the sermon dives really deep into Naomi's immense grief, because the heartbreaking events compound so quickly. First, her husband Elimelech dies. Her two sons end up marrying Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But then, as we know, after 10 years, both sons pass away too. Completely destitute, Naomi makes the hard choice to return to Israel with Ruth. But she comes back deeply bitter. She's angry at God and feels completely, totally abandoned by her circumstances. Looking at Naomi's overwhelming bitterness, the pastor makes this observation to his congregation. Relational difficulty is the furnace God uses to mold a woman's character. This direct quote is essentially the speaker's secondary thesis for the sermon. He's arguing that men and women don't just act differently, they actually process and are shaped by hardship in fundamentally different ways. He draws a really sharp contrast here. The pastor suggests that a man's character is typically molded by occupational stress. Think job loss, missing out on a promotion, or the heavy burden of struggling to provide as a foundation builder. Conversely, he asserts that a woman's character is forged in that furnace of relational difficulty. It's the family conflicts, the deep betrayals, and the strained emotional bonds that ultimately shape, test, and refine a woman. So, how is a modern woman supposed to survive that relational furnace? Well, the speaker points his audience straight to the famous biblical passage, Proverbs 31. He outlines the traits of the ultimate godly woman. She's clothed in strength and dignity. She literally laughs at the future instead of fearing it. She speaks with wisdom. She completely refuses idleness, and she's deeply praised by her family. The sermon is urging modern women to embody these specific traits, to lean on faithful friends, and to stay industriously dignified, even when their relational world feels like it's completely falling apart.
Which brings us right into Act 3, Redemption and Legacy.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this is the turning point. This is where bold personal agency actually triggers that ancient cultural safety net we talked about earlier. First, Ruth fiercely pledges her loyalty to her bitter mother-in-law, Naomi. She absolutely refuses to leave her side. Then, instead of just giving up, she goes to work. She starts gleaning leftover grain in the fields of a man named Boaz. Well, Boaz notices, and he steps up to act as that crucial kinsman redeemer. Finally, they marry and have a son. It's a complete 180, transitioning the family from utter desperate ruin to total restoration. Out of this miraculous turnaround comes the pastor's ultimate core Mother's Day takeaway for his audience. Never give up on your family or your faith. He strongly emphasizes that even when things seem completely, hopelessly broken, you just have to endure. His theological perspective here is that God actually cares more about preserving marriages and families than the individuals themselves do in the moment. Therefore, pushing through those dark times isn't just an option, it's essential. And honestly, that perseverance mattered on a scale they couldn't have imagined. Look at this historical ripple effect. Generation 1, Boaz and Ruth marry. Generation 2, their son Obed is born. Generation 3, Obed has a son named Jesse. And then, Generation 4, King David is born. Think about that. This small, destitute, grieving family's survival in Bethlehem didn't just save Naomi from poverty, it directly led to the birth of Israel's greatest king and ultimately established the lineage of Jesus. Which leads to this genuinely profound quote from the sermon. Sometimes the blessing of God is later, but it's never late. I mean, that perfectly captures this speaker's view on delayed gratification, doesn't it? He's using Naomi and Ruth's story to tell modern listeners that maintaining enduring faith through the darkest, seemingly most pointless chapters of your life is actually worth it. The ultimate resolution might simply be arriving much later than you expected. The pastor actually shares a really touching personal story to back this up. He talks about his Norwegian grandmother, who told him when he was just 12 years old, mind you, that she was already actively praying for his future wife. Decades later, looking back, he realizes that while the woman who became his wife wasn't even religious at the time, his grandmother was faithfully praying for her through all her difficulties. Now, his grandmother passed away before she ever got to see the result, but it so beautifully illustrates his point, the unseen, long-term, multi-generational impact of a mother's quiet, enduring faith. So the crucial point is this: how do ancient texts continue to shape modern definitions of resilience and family roles today? Whether you personally agree with the specific theological and gender frameworks presented in this sermon or not, you have to admit, it is absolutely fascinating. A 3,000-year-old story about ancient land rights, an agricultural famine, and a grieving widow in Bethlehem is actively being used right now to encourage, define, and mold the cultural frameworks for thousands of modern listeners. It really leaves us with a whole lot to think about regarding the enduring, living power of these ancient narratives, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time.